Good afternoon, British and American culture. This lecture is coming to you a little bit late, as all my lectures this week were delivered a day or two later. Thank you very much for your patience, if that's what it was, or if you were busy with studying for midterms, that's fine. A couple of things. Everyone had submitted their assignment a couple weeks ago. I'm aware of that. I need to catch up and give you a grade and give you some comments about what you did. I realize that nobody has been harassing me about getting back to you, which is nice. But a little bit of harassment is normal. So we had a quiz this week. My main concern is the fact that still there was only 41 students out of 55 who actually took the quiz and completed it on time. What I'm noticing is that you have 10 minutes to do the quiz, and there's a lot of students that are submitting it in the 10th minute. So my suspicion is that some of you actually are doing the quiz but not submitting the form in time. It's a black and white situation. If you hand it in 9 minutes and 59 seconds, it gets accepted. And if you are 1 second late, you get a 0. So let me remind you, there's a lot of people submitting at 9 minutes. I think fine. A whole minute remaining is safe. But there's at least a dozen of you, 12 at least, that each time you're submitting the form in the 10th minute. The reason I'm keeping it to 10 minutes strictly is because I don't want people looking up the answers. I don't want to give you extra time. I'm sorry. Normally in class, if there was a few people that still needed a few extra minutes, I would just let you do that. But this is the way it is. So you've got to submit that form within the 10-minute limit, or you get a 0. So we've done 3 quizzes. As I told you, I've sort of reduced the overall value of the quiz. So each quiz is worth 3%. If you've missed 3 quizzes, you're down 9%. So it's starting to get serious. As far as I know, there's about 10 people who have still not successfully submitted their quiz. So this is a big concern because next Thursday at 10 a.m. we do have a midterm. Okay? So I need you, all 55 students, to log in to your cyber lecture at 10 a.m. on Thursday, which will be October 22nd. I need you to log in and you're going to have 40 minutes to complete this thing. It's going to be 30 multiple choice. They're going to be similar to the quizzes. So there is about 15 to 20% of you who are getting 9s and 10s on your quizzes. So you know your stuff. You'll blow through the multiple choice section. And then there will be 2 questions that are not multiple choice. And you need to write an answer that amounts to 5 points, okay? There's going to be 2 questions, so 30 multiple choice. There's going to be 2 questions. They're short answer. I call them short. You might call it long. Doesn't really matter. But essentially, you have to write a short paragraph. Very similar to what your assignment was. Choose an event in British or American history. I think it was just British history. Had to be related to British culture in some way. Part of the empire or part of British culture itself in the United Kingdom. And there was a lot of really good descriptions of events and why they're important. Similarly, I'm going to give you a question, something like, tell me, and this is a dead giveaway, to be honest. So those of you who watch the video lecture and pay attention and write notes are going to have a huge advantage. I can see the future. It is my own midterm. So I usually ask a question, something like, what were the significant invasions during the first millennium, and which cultures had an impact on the development of British culture? Okay, we're talking here about, if I say invasions, that doesn't include the Celts, although they did invade, but we didn't really discuss that. It would be Roman, Anglo-Saxon, which is German, Danish, which is Viking, and Norman, right? Over the first 1,000 years of British history that we talked about 5 cultures. Celtic was sort of the original culture that we don't have much of a record about. And then the Romans came and they sort of merged with the Celtic culture, and they created this Romano-Briton culture. And then the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic, and they invaded, and they contributed English, Angleland, England. Certain things were, absorbed by the culture, and they contributed to what eventually will become British. We're still not there, actually, because it is 1707 where officially the United Kingdom is created, and we have something called Great Britain. So we're still not there. I will do one more video lecture next week in preparation for the midterm, and I will discuss these things in more detail. I'm going to sort of do a recap. There is the content for today, which is largely a big picture, 17th century, why are we talking about these things lecture. And then next week, I got to talk about the Civil War. We have to talk about the kings and queens, the end of Elizabeth's reign and King James and everything else. I'm going to talk about that in one lecture, and then I'm going to do a short review. Maybe it'll be like 15 or 20 minutes to help you prepare for your midterm. So let me not get into the review too much, which I already started to, but I'm just warning you, this is what the format of the midterm is going to be. 30 multiple choice, 2 short answer questions where you have to provide information and analysis related to the things you learned already in the class. Okay, so today I've been blocking my board, but we are talking about the 17th century. The 17th century is probably the most important period in English history. I did note that I didn't say British history, I said English history. But regardless, that doesn't really matter. That's just an opinion. But I think you can see so many things. It's a transition period. The 17th century is, 16th century is still hanging on to a lot of the medieval things and that's the reason why I studied it, to be honest. When I was in undergrad, I grew up liking fantasy in particular. I read fantasy books, and I went to church all the time because my father is a minister, a Protestant minister. So in my mind, I think there were already these seeds of medievalism really were sown, whether it wasn't really my parents' plan necessarily. It's just my childhood was full of ideas of magic and dragons and knights and honor and warriors and heroes, as many of us do think of when we're young. Probably now there's more of a tendency towards superheroes and Marvel, Superman, DC, Batman, Spider-Man, Iron Man, etc. In my case, though, I was really into fantasy type stories, and Harry Potter came too late for me because I was already becoming an adult. So, but there is a group of young people that are obsessed with Harry Potter because it came out when they were in elementary school or middle school, and that was about 10 years too late for me. But I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, all sorts of Dungeons and Dragons sort of books. And this influenced me enough that when I went to university and I decided what I wanted to do was study English, that the 16th century was sort of the perfect medium between the present and the past. And that's why we spent so much time talking about Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, because they're real people, but they certainly influenced all kinds of imaginings of what culture was like. Queen Elizabeth reimagined herself as the Virgin Queen. She took the sort of belief in Mary, the mother of Jesus. Sorry, I almost said father there. That the Virgin Mary, and the belief, the huge, group of people across Europe that worshipped Mary and prayed to her, and sort of incorporated that into her own image, that she also was a mother, even though she had never given birth, because that's the thing about Mary too, is she actually didn't give birth to Jesus. It was a immaculate conception. She was visited by an angel, and then she had a baby and she remained a virgin. And that those stories kind of, she was able to, with her intelligence and her political savvy and her manipulation of all the people around her, and her cultivation of the arts and everything, create this image of this kind of warrior queen, mother of England. All of these things came together. This is what the 16th century became, was this point where English people, although they'd had a rough time for several hundred years, fighting with France and with all kinds of issues, that they overcame these things, and Queen Elizabeth became symbolic. Certainly when she was young and she became the queen, nobody knew that she was going to lead England for 40 years and become this person. But now, looking backwards, we have this image that she was perfect from the very beginning. This period actually overlaps with the Imjin War, and the Spanish Armada occurs in 1588, and Imjin Wedan for Korean students is 1592 to 1598, and in the 1590s, England had a horrible, economic depression, and that was towards the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and we just deleted that because of her, just kind of cleaned it up and pretended it didn't happen. Meanwhile, in Asia, Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded Korea and caused mass devastation and starvation and damage to Korean culture, to the Chosun Kingdom. And Yi Sun-shin rose, through that adversity and became a hero, which we all remember now. So Queen Elizabeth sort of paints a picture of everything going well the whole time that she's the queen, even though the country is going through some terrible, awful times. And that's the thing about Yi Sun-shin too, is that he's a fantastic hero, savior of the Chosun people, just like Queen Elizabeth or Nelson or any number of other heroes we'll discuss throughout the rest of the course for English culture. But it was a horrible time to be a Korean person. And similarly, the latter part of the 16th century was a really bad time to be an English person. So let's discuss that a little bit. As we go into the 17th century, what's going on? I put these things on the board already, and I sort of shunted them down the lecture schedule so that I could make time for them. But I want you to remember these things, okay? Especially these 4 things that made life in England and Scotland and Ireland, let's include the three kingdoms really difficult. These are the problems: sovereignty, foreign policy, finance, and religion. And these are problems that began in the 16th century or the 15th century. They've sort of been a problem for over 100 years. By the time you get to 1600 and Elizabeth dies, not right in 1600, but a few years afterwards, and her nephew, James, becomes the king. At that point, life is not going that well for most of the people in England and Scotland. Like I said, the 1590s was terrible. So let's just take a look at these ideas first and try to understand how they contribute to English culture and British culture as a whole. Sovereignty means the power invested in someone, right? So in some countries, all of the power was located in the king. And we talked about Henry VIII and how he dissolved the Catholic Church in order to get more power for himself, political power, financial power, and everything. And so his solution to his problem was to make himself the leader of both the church and the state. And this gave him more sovereignty, right? But basically, since Magna Carta, the power of making decisions, the political power and the ability to make decisions was sort of slowly being reduced. Like I said, it was a bunch of rich barons that protested against King John in order to get, more influence over what was done in the kingdom. So they were sort of forcing King John to give some of his power away to them. And this process continued despite the fact that King John asked the Pope to cancel everything, and he took away the power from the barons as fast as he could. And, future kings would try and keep the power more, invested in themselves, like Henry VIII. Anybody who disagreed with him, he would kill them. He became really a sovereign power, an absolute leader almost. Even though there was a parliament, his personality and his force of will basically made it so the parliament couldn't do anything. Queen Elizabeth, by the time Edward and Mary had gone through their, short period of leadership, by the time Queen Elizabeth took over, she needed parliament. She needed the agreement of powerful people in the kingdom. So this balance starts to shift towards the people, the representatives of the people, or supposed. They're actually not really representative, because you think of democracy like now. Remember, we all get to vote if we're adults and we're not criminals and we haven't, for some reason, been stripped of our right to vote. All adults who are citizens in Korea, I'm not one of them, but all of you are, you have the right to vote. But of course, that's not the way it was 400 years ago in England. Only rich people were allowed to vote. At least a little bit rich. And they didn't really vote for multiple people. There was just probably one famous person in your area, and you just had to support that person. There wasn't such thing as, I think one of the professors that I listened to, American professors who lectures on the 17th century, he said it's not parliamentary election, it's parliamentary selection. So the person is chosen. You don't even have a choice of two. And that still seems like not a great, in a lot of countries like Korea, there's like 10 people you can vote for, right? There's 10 candidates. In your area, there will probably just be one. So they're not very representative of the people, but they claimed that they were sort of democratic representatives, and those people composed a parliament. And the main thing that made Parliament powerful was the fact that England was constantly fighting other countries, Spain, France, Netherlands, various other European powers in and out of these wars. And if you want to fight a war, you need a lot of money. So if you keep having wars, then number 3 comes into play, where you need money. And unlike France or some other countries, the British king, the English king, I say British because King James is King of the Scots and King of the English, we will find out. But as you go into the 17th century, the king of both kingdoms, the King of Scotland and the King of England, he can't just get the money by saying, give me your money. In France, he could almost do that because there was no group of people making decisions with the king. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, would just essentially send out his tax collectors, and he had a big army, and just take what amount of money he needed from everyone, from poor people and rich people alike. And if they didn't like it, then they could talk to a person with a sword. But that's not the way it worked in England. And this is one of the reasons that we're studying this culture right now, is because British culture evolved step by step into this culture that was participatory. Everybody started to have a role in this. Gradually, a number of people participating in decisions and in government would expand from the 16th century onward. So basically, you're talking about, in the medieval period, like I said to you before, the chain of being was the main concept of how society was organized. So if you're at the bottom, you did not get to say anything. You belonged at the bottom, and that's where you would stay. And your children would be there too. You don't get to comment on what the king is doing. If the king is bad or the king is good, that's what God decided, and you do not get to challenge that. However, you can see how a king who's at the top, who has to ask permission to get money from the people below him, the chain of being starts to break down very gradually. People start to think that maybe they do have a right to question what the Pope... I mean, it's Henry VIII that removed the Pope in the first place. If the kings remove popes, why can't dukes remove kings? And barons remove dukes, and lords remove barons, and middle-class merchants or townspeople remove barons. I mean, it's sort of Henry VIII's fault that all of these things are happening. Like I said, these problems is not really something that the kings and queens created in the 17th century, but they will have to deal with it because Henry VIII and his children, including Queen Elizabeth, tried to avoid them. So they need money. They're always in trouble fighting other people. They need money, and they have to ask for it. They have to ask for it. The only way to get a lot of money, the amounts of money that they need, is to get the leaders of society, the rich people who are in parliament, sitting like in a blue house, like our elected people do. You know, poor people even in a democracy where everybody votes, it's not like we vote beggars and poor people and people with no jobs to represent us. We still, the people in the blue house are all wealthy people. None of those people in our democracy are people that are lower class. They're all upper class. They're all educated. They're all rich. So the system is not that different. And this is why we call this period the early modern period. That's why 16th century and 17th century England is so important. Like I said, you start to notice that these people are living lives more similar to ours, but they're caught in between the medieval culture and the modern culture. So we call them early modern. And the fourth reason that they have trouble is the one that's medieval. It's the religious thing. I told you already, one of the things about England you have to understand is that just like other European countries, the whole community, the whole society was organized around church. What you think of as a person who loves church and is very spiritual now, if you think somebody who goes to church, on Sunday and then they stay there all afternoon, and then Tuesday they go in Bible study, and Wednesday they go to choir, and Thursday they volunteer, and Friday they do mission work. That's a really, serious, devoted, religious person in 2020. But that person would not be very religious. In the 16th century, 500 years ago, that person would be normal at best. They would be, okay, you're doing a bit, but what you should really do is, pick up your sword, dedicate yourself to the church, and then go to another country and then fight for your religion. Right? That would be a really dedicated person. Somebody who just stayed home and went to church and went to Bible study and participated in missions and sang some songs. That is like not a big deal. To us, that's super religious. To them, not so much. So this is where, though, people start to focus more on themselves rather than on the structure of society and on religion. People start to think about themselves, as individuals, and they start to think about philosophy and nature and like why things are. Not just God put it there, everything's organized because that's the way God designed it, but that there might be other answers, right? So as we go into this era, you're going to get people like William Shakespeare, right? And he's a humanist. And this is what we call the Renaissance. It's a rebirth of culture. But it's not, in England, it's different. It's not the Italian Renaissance, because the Italian Renaissance is recovering Roman culture and Roman classical learning. But England didn't really have that. They were part of the Roman Empire. We talked about that. They were influenced by Roman culture and Roman life, but they were not Roman. They weren't the center of the Roman Empire. So when the Italian Renaissance happened, it happened there locally, and it was a recovery of their own culture. But the English Renaissance was sort of a couple hundred years late. The 14th century and the 15th century was the flowering of Latin culture and the recovery of all the classical learning in Italy. But, towards the end of the 16th century, England finally, after, recovering from the plague and the famine and everything else, they start to, have this explosion of culture, which we call the Renaissance. William Shakespeare is probably... he's one of the greatest writers of all time, whatever people want to argue. He sometimes gets criticized for being too popular. In his own period, though, he was sort of locally popular. And then it wasn't until about 100 years later, when there was translations into French and German, when English culture started to become more powerful and more influential, that Shakespeare just got translated into every language around the world, and everybody started to think he was the genius that we all know him to be. Basically, Shakespeare and his other contemporaries, like Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe or Spencer or Sir Philip Sidney. It's the reason that it's not just the quality, because it's incredible. The writing is amazing. They're experts at manipulating English language. Shakespeare created 2,000 new words and expressions that have become part of our language, that you use them all the time, even in your second language. But I'm a native speaker, and I speak using Shakespeare every day, and I have no idea that I do. That's how profound his effect has been. So, you know, I said Chaucer was the father of English, and we really quickly moved through his contribution. But these are the reasons why we mention these people. Chaucer was the father of English because he's kind of the root, right? But what am I going to say about Shakespeare? He's the fertilizer, I guess. You know, you put the seed in the ground and it grows, but if you don't continue to nurture it, it doesn't grow into this big, beautiful tree. But that is, Shakespeare appeared at a critical moment, along with all these other people too, to be fair. But Shakespeare is the greatest of them. His contribution is to cause this branching out, this explosion in vocabulary and technique and turns of phrase, of expressions and different things that make the English language compete, I guess you want to say, with French and Italian and the other great languages in Europe. Lots of them are already established. They have a lot of great writing that's being already produced, and Shakespeare sort of exceeds them, to be honest. He supersedes them, and he puts English on a different level. There was a point where English was not appropriate to, you know, use to describe the Bible, because people said, well, Latin is a beautiful language, and that's the language that we should use to explain what the content of the Bible is. But English is too crude and underdeveloped. We can't use that to describe what's in the Bible. But King James, at the end of Shakespeare's life, King James will commission a Bible with a lot of intelligent English people. You might say this is kind of like a Sejong moment, where you get a whole bunch of really smart people together and then you create Hangul. And Hangul just puts Korean culture on a different track. It's going one direction. It's got Hanja. It's got all this, you know, vocabulary coming down from China. And then Sejong decides he's going to create his own set of characters. And this is going to send Korean culture down a different track. It's going to blossom, right? All the things that come after that. I know Yangban used Hangul very seldomly because they preferred Hanja. But eventually, Hangul would become the language, and it would, you know, now people study Hanja as sort of a curiosity, but Hangul is the practical, logical, efficient language that everybody's proud of. Similarly, I know some of you are not from Korea, but you're probably familiar with Korean language, and you know that one of the things about Korean language that is so impressive is the characters, and how easy they are to learn, and how logical and how sort of how well designed they are. I learned it in like 2 days. Learned how to read the characters. Doesn't mean I understand what I'm reading, but I can read it. William Shakespeare did to the English something that put it down a different path. It became a figurative language. It became a language that was invested with culture and meaning and was capable of describing things at a level that no other language can. We have more words in English than any other language. Thank you, Shakespeare. It's your fault. Okay? Don't blame me. I'm just saying. One guy added 2,000 words and expressions. It was a trend that would continue, and he would take words from other languages and other contexts, and he would change them, and he would combine them And that's why sometimes people call him the wordsmith, like a metalsmith. A metalsmith is somebody who creates things out of metal. Shakespeare is a man who created things out of words. He made words, right? He crafted new sentences. What can I say? Some people think he was not a real person or that it wasn't him that did it. I think all of that is kind of speculation. I think there really was a guy who grew up, went to grammar school, borrowed books from a rich guy's house, studied on his own. There's this period called like the missing years where he's like 10 years, he just doesn't do very much. I don't think he was doing nothing. He just wasn't well known, and he was building up his repertoire, and he was preparing himself to create these things that we know him for. And that's why Shakespeare is the greatest writer in English history. Again, that's a personal opinion. There's lots of choices. We'll talk about others too, Dickens, Austen, and others. But certainly, William Shakespeare belongs at the top. And he was, like I said, he lived at a time where the King James Bible was being developed shortly after, at the end of his career. And the English Book of Prayer also. These are just books that are written in English, and then they're printed and they're distributed everywhere. So you look at the 17th century and you start to see, yes, that's like us. That's about 25% of the population learned how to read 400 years ago, which is, you think that's low because our literacy rate is 99.9% now, but people in Chosun, I mean, the rate of literacy in other countries was far below 10% in most cases. In the medieval period, only the clergy, only people trained as priests or monks or aristocrats who were rich, only those people could read. But now you got 1 in 4. I mean, we would be talking about in 700 years ago or 800 years ago, you'd be talking about less than 5% of people being able to read anything. But 1 in 4 people could read English. And they're reading the Bible mostly. So it's still anchored in this religious culture. But it doesn't really matter what they're reading. It's just the fact that they can read. This is something we take for granted. So I'm going to get back to the textbook and talk about the Civil War in the next lecture, because that's a different topic. But like I said, these are the problems. We got one down at the bottom there that I didn't mention. We're going to cover that next class because leadership involves mostly kings and queens and how they behave and what their policies are. Along with the other important people in the country, which would be Parliament. But back to the big picture things, like basically we're talking about that today. As you go into the 17th century, these are the things that you start to recognize are more similar to us. So religion becomes something gradually in the next 100 years of our course, not 100 years that I'm talking, but the period, the next 100 years of English history and Scottish history, the people increasingly become literate. They start to question everything, their place in the world, even in the universe, sort of. Their spirituality, becomes grounded in understanding the Bible instead of just listening to what important people say. As they sort of look at their life differently, and more people get educated, you end up with, at the end of the 17th century, people like John Locke and Isaac Newton, which are in the book, and you'll see. Isaac Newton, one of arguably the smartest people who has ever lived. He doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's not that there was no other intelligent people. There's kind of, just like Shakespeare, there's kind of a group of them. There's all these thinkers, all these people that, you know, we would call them philosophers or scientists, where they're looking at the world in a different way and they try to understand it. And this is what modern people do. This is what we do. This is how we understand our world. Isaac Newton lives in the 17th century. So does John Locke. There's a whole bunch of other people from other countries too, but I am talking about British and American culture here. So we'll go into this, you know, discussion of what things start to happen. I mentioned about empire. It is at the beginning of the 17th century that Ireland finally sort of gets treated like a colony and gets attacked, colonized, controlled, dominated by English culture in a way that it never has before. There was always an influence, you know, both ways between the countries, but it wasn't until the 17th century that basically the English constantly sent military expeditions to Ireland to enforce the laws and change their life and their culture. And often you will find that Irish people say that they have some similarities with, you know, the Korean experience of being colonized by Japan. And what I have to say about that is there are enough similarities that you can have a conversation about it. But what Koreans, you know how everybody feels about the Japanese policy and about what happened to Korea historically. Imagine that after the Imjin War, that Japan never left, right? Instead of Yi Sun-shin defeating the Japanese Navy and the Japanese withdrawing after Chinese intervention in the Imjin War in 1598, they went back to Japan. Imagine that they didn't go back, but that they stayed until 1910, until 1945. That they stayed for 350 years and imposed Japanese cultural, you know, perspectives, you know, vigorously. What would Korea be like now? Essentially, that is what went on. The relationship between England and Ireland was like that. That Ireland was controlled, subdued, dominated by England, and then from there, once they had done that, and then they unified with Scotland in a sort of junior partnership, they created this unified kingdom, this British entity, and then they spread all over the world. I'm not going to lie, it's imperialism is a really bad thing. That we're going to delay that concept until after the midterm, because I don't want to include imperialism as things that you need to remember, but it's tied up with the whole American independence movement, and it's fundamental to the understanding of how British culture and American culture develop from now on. Is the idea of that empire has benefits and it has advantages and disadvantages, and the perspective on that is fundamental to understanding where American culture and British culture are today. So that is a wrap for today. I am going to briefly recap the medieval modern transition idea at the beginning of next lecture to remind you, and then I'm going to talk specifically about the English Civil War, John Locke, Isaac Newton, and the 17th century kings and queens and leadership in general. That will be our next lecture, and that'll be the final lecture before I do a short review and we have midterm. Okay? So I hope you're listening carefully to what I said, because many of the things that I said today are actually not in the textbook. So make sure you write this down. Fair warning, make sure that you make some notes on what I said, because not everything that I said today is actually in the textbook. It's sort of a hole that needs to be closed in a future edition. So thank you for listening. 45-minute mark just passed. I apologize for making long videos. It's not usually my intention. I like short ones just like you, but we do have to get through the material in order to, understand how American and British culture are constructed. So please listen to this. Maybe stop halfway through or replay to get the full version, and I will be talking to you again in a couple days when I upload the second half of the 17th century lecture series. Thank you very much. Have a good day.